I'm Sonia Elijah. I'm an independent investigative journalist and former BBC researcher with a background in economics. I've been doing in-depth investigations into the COVID-19 response for the past 5 years, and my work has been featured in Trial Site News, TCW Defending Freedom, the Brownstone Institute, Children's Health Defence Europe, Epoch Times, and Zero Hedge. Actually, before I even want to start the presentation, I just want to commend your group, Doctors for COVID Ethics, for your hard work in advocating for medical ethics and patient safety. So I'm going to start the presentation. So I've got a little short video, sort of like a trailer for the book. So 311 Viral Takeover is my debut book. It is a forensic investigation into the proclaimed once-in-a-century pandemic and what was done in its name. So it is essentially, it's an evidence-based examination, and it exposes the coordinated narrative that justified unprecedented lockdowns, flawed testing protocols, the rushed vaccine authorizations, the hidden harms, widespread censorship, and the rise of digital authoritarianism. The book is based on thousands of Freedom of Information Act released documents. These are primary documents, leaked emails and confidential papers, scientific papers, whistleblower interviews, forensic research, exclusive reporting. It has over 900 citations, actually 941 citations, and it's got over 120 exhibits. So the name 311, it's so 311 it's essentially, that's when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. So I mark that as 311, but the book draws a parallel with 9/11, which we saw in 2001, where and I see 311 almost like a biological sequel to that. So at 9/11, we saw this rise of state surveillance of citizens. We saw the introduction of the Patriot Act. And just in for March 11th, 2020, what we've seen is citizen compliance with the state. And we have, the rise of the Coronavirus Act and similar acts throughout the world as well. But essentially, what we have is a crisis and fear being weaponized for then more expanded powers. So I start the book with looking at the origins. And I essentially, what I did, it's three pillar publications essentially lock in the natural origin story. So we have all these sort of lab related concerns being dismissed as conspiracy theories, and I just want to I want to show you. So I've got a key exhibit in this slide. You've got an email coming from Francis Collins, who was director of the NIH at the time, writing to Anthony Fauci. And we've got him actually pointing to the Nature Medicine article. So you've got on the left side, you've got these three publications that sort of lock in this natural origin story. The first is the joint statement in the Lancet, which was done early 2020, and you have 26 out of the 27 signers of that paper tied, which who have funding ties to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Their conflicts of interest were never disclosed for the paper. Following that, you have Nature Medicine's infamous, I would say, proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. This was the pivotal paper which dismissed any sort of lab origin theory. It was completely dismissed. And you also have Cells, the Origins of SARS-CoV-2, a critical review that came around the fall of that year. So, but the email on the right-hand side, you can see, I mean, you've got, wondering if there's something NIH can do to help put down this very destructive conspiracy with what seems to be growing momentum. And you've got a link he's cited there to do with the outbreak starting in a Wuhan lab. And it's really telling that he writes, I hope the Nature Medicine article on the genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 would settle this. Is there anything more we can do? So it gives you a snapshot of what was going on. The first two chapters of the book, I went through thousands of the Fauci emails. These were released by Freedom of Information Act request. And you see a pivotal teleconference call that happened in February the 1st, 2020. The key figures and orchestrators of that call was Sir Jeremy Farrar, who was leading the Wellcome Trust at the time. He now obviously now works for the World Health Organization. You have Anthony Fauci, you've got Christian Drosten, you've got Christian Anderson, Robert Gary, all the sort of gain of function research scientists involved, and they all come together to decide on what the official narrative will be. And even the emails afterwards, you sort of see this sense of relief, backslapping going on, that they're all happy to be in this sort of agreement. Now, what is also interesting with these with these released emails, I mean, obviously they are heavily redacted, but you can see that there is this just coordinated narrative they all agree on that takes place. And they're all essentially they're protecting themselves, protecting gain of function industry. What they actually discuss amongst themselves privately, they actually agree that it is coming from a lab. You have very sort of revealing emails that go into that, especially Slack messages from Christian Drosten, completely believing it's come from a lab, but then in public, a completely different story is portrayed. So and then the second chapter talks about the cracks in the narrative. I don't have a slide for that. Obviously, I do want you guys to read the book. I can't do a slide on everything, but it talks about the cracks. So you've got the diffused proposal, that leaked document. You've got that explosive Indian paper by Pradham et al., which looks at the 4 HIV-like inserts. It's just, the cracks in the narrative. It's very, very damning. So the book then takes us through to what I call expert takeover. So this is where you have leading scientists, and I did this more from a UK perspective. So I looked at SAGE, it stands for the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. And you had a leading figure here, Professor Neil Ferguson. So he was leading SPIM at the time. SPIM stands for Scientific Pandemic Insights Group on Modeling. So his paper, this is coming from Imperial College London, which it receives heavy funding from the Gates Foundation. And actually, Neil Ferguson himself, he is the director of the Vaccine Impact Modeling Consortium, which is also based at Imperial College, which is closely tied to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which of course is again funded by the Gates Foundation. So his team comes out with Report 9. That is published on March 16th, 2020. And this report is a pivotal for driving lockdowns because it's the predictions in that paper, these modeling projections, are so catastrophic that if countries don't lock down, they're going to see hundreds of millions of deaths worldwide. For example, just over 500,000 deaths in the UK, over 2.5 million deaths in the US, again, if countries don't lock down. And this paper is severely flawed for many reasons. You have it relying on the case fatality ratio in Wuhan, China, and not from other places where the case fatality ratio was much lower. It's based on lab confirmed cases rather than actual infection rates. Also, importantly, ignored evidence, and this is early evidence, which indicated a much lower infection fatality ratio. And a prime example for this is the Diamond Princess cruise ship. It also relied on exponential growth of the virus. And what is interesting, so on the right, you see this sort of, I did just a snapshot of this New York Times article, again, the same day the paper is published. On the 16th of March, you got the New York Times highlighting this paper, and it says federal guidelines warned against gatherings of more than 10 people as a London report predicted high fatalities in the US without drastic action. You also have, and I wanted to juxtapose it with, again, another email coming from, again, Francis Collins, who was leading the NIH at the time, again writing to Anthony Fauci, and he is essentially highlighting the Great Barrington Declaration, and he is calling them the three fringe epidemiologists. So he's referring to essentially doctors Sunitra Gupta, Jay Bhattacharya, and Martin Kulldorff, the three scientists who basically founded the Great Barrington Declaration, where they came together to advocate for focused protection, essentially herd immunity, and against locking down. But very quickly, the world condemned, well, the media and these leading public health officials, they were condemned, they were smeared, they were called dangerous, that their ideology was dangerous and unethical even. You had the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, he was, again, jumped on that and calling these scientists unethical. So I just want to highlight this. But we have, again, a near synchronous fashion of countries worldwide going into lockdown, and it's sort of lockdowns in lockstep. And I'm just going to now move on to, actually, before I move on, what's also interesting is this email, you see Francis referring to the Nobel Prize winner, Mike Leavitt at Stanford. So Mike Leavitt, he was a Stanford professor. And just the month before, in February 2020, he wrote a paper where he's essentially found very early evidence that the growth of the virus was actually slowing down. So cases were dropping, and he was looking at Wuhan in China. And so his paper completely contradicts what the flawed Neil Ferguson Report 9 came out with. So that's an interesting contrast. And also the fact that Francis highlights him, Mike Leavitt, for being one of the a co-signature. He's also signed the Great Barrington Declaration. Actually, over 1 million people went on to sign the Great Barrington Declaration. So I'm now moving on to the next slide. So this again has more of a UK perspective. You've got obviously the NHS logo on those really those very fear-mongering government messaging. And essentially what we saw was this programming of fear, and then as a result of that, you had compliance. They weaponized fear. And this is you've got so you have on the left, you have these ad campaigns that were seen across the UK, billboards, radios, TV, wherever you looked, you had these very ominous, very, just terrifying images of people sort of gasping for air and really scaring the British public where they actually died in their own homes. They were so scared, they refused to even go get hospital treatment, and they died of many other symptoms of, undiagnosed cancers, heart attacks. And it was a really terrible crime. On the right, you see this is a government white paper. So this is a paper that came. This is from SAGE, the group I mentioned earlier, and this is a paper coming from a meeting of behavioral scientists. And what you see here is they are proposing to use media, it says, to increase sense of personal threat. They're also considering enacting legislation to compel required behaviors. Even I've sort of red circled, consider use of social disapproval for failure to comply. So you have a systematic psychological operations taking place, Psyops, against the public. And it was very effective. And this is why so many people complied and followed the rules. So I'm now moving on to the next slide. So here I wanted to examine the PCR tests because the PCR tests were really underpinned, and it sort of prolonged the lockdowns. It was, if you test positive, you have to stay home, quarantine, isolate. But what essentially it was, these are flawed testing protocols that justified lockdowns. And there's a quote at the bottom. This is from Dr. Carrie Mullis, who is actually the inventor of the PCR technique, and it's from an interview in 1993. And he clearly states it. This is referring to his own PCR test that he invented. It doesn't tell you that you're sick. But yet we have the PCR being the test that was used, billions of pounds, dollars worldwide being spent on this fraudulent test that doesn't tell you that you're sick. So I wanted to do a bit about the history of this. So around early January 2020, we've got the German virologist Professor Christian Drosten, who develops this reverse transcription RT PCR protocol for the novel virus. And what is interesting, so dates to me are really important, actually. There's the appendix in the beginning of the book where I do a very sort of a timeline, very detailed timeline of key dates, and that took me actually quite a few months to compile. But when you see these dates, you see a lot of anomalies arise. For example, the viral genome sequence was uploaded to virological.org on January 10th, 2020. You have 3 days later Christian Drosten's PCR protocol being accepted by the World Health Organization. This is 2 months before a pandemic is even declared. You have associated with the test, you have the Corman-Drosten paper, which is it is associated with the protocol, the PCR protocol. That's submitted to the journal Eurosurveillance, where, as it happens, Drosten is also the editor of that journal, and that's submitted on January 21st. The peer review occurs in less than 24 hours, which is unprecedented. The paper's published on the 23rd. But what was most striking about this is the failure to disclose significant conflicts of interest of the paper's authors. So Olfert Lant is also a co-author of that paper. He's the CEO of the biotech company based in Berlin, Tib Molbiol. And that's the same company that goes on to produce the SARS-CoV-2 testing kits, with the first being sent on January 10th. So remember, January 10th, that's the date the viral genome sequence is uploaded, and it's the same day these tests are being sent to Hong Kong. And I got that from actually a German, doing some research at a German paper. Um, and then we've also got Marco Kaiser, who is another co-author of this paper, and he happens to be a scientific advisor at Tib Mobile. But again, all of these conflicts of interests are not disclosed, including, of course, Christian Drosden's conflicts of interests. And it takes, I think, 3 revisions of the paper for some of these conflicts to actually become disclosed, because there's such uproar over this. And there was a 22-person international consortium led by Dr. Pieter Berger, who they found 10 major scientific flaws to do with this RT-PCR protocol. And also what is interesting is that just last year, October 2025, you have a German peer-reviewed study analyzing official testing data from 2020 to 2021, and it found a staggering 86% of false positive rate. And I wrote about this, probably in 2021. I did a 3-part investigative series, Scandals of the PCR Test, and anything above a cycle threshold of 35 is high risk, leads to a false positive test. And again, this was the PCR test. This is what they justified lockdowns. My book, I also write about the rapid antigen tests and all the scandals linked with Innova Medical Group. I haven't done a slide for this, obviously. I can't go into too much detail, and I will move on, but I've also written on these rapid antigen tests too. Right. This is all about eliminating the competition. So there's a chapter in the book that really focuses on how hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, how they were blacklisted, smeared. And I really go into detail in the book about this, because I think it's incredibly important, because we need to remember that emergency use authorization for these COVID shots was only granted on the basis that there is no other treatment for COVID. And that was not true, because early COVID treatments like the anti-malarial hydroxychloroquine was proven to be highly effective, as well as the anti-parasitic drug ivermectin. What is interesting is that you have May 22, 2020, you've got the Mehra et al. Study being published. And you have the company, which is a small Chicago-based company no one had ever heard of, called Surgisphere, that provides the large data sets for the Mehra et al. Study. And the Mehra et al. Study went on to say that hydroxychloroquine is essentially dangerous, that it leads to cardiovascular issues, people having heart attacks, and it's not effective against COVID. So, but what happens is that this is a completely fraudulent study, because the data is based on faked data, essentially. And even this study actually gets retracted, because there is such uproar about this. But despite the retraction, on the heels of this study, and that's why you see a BBC article, again, the same date, can you see, May 22nd, 2020, Trump drug hydroxychloroquine raises death risk in COVID patients, study says. And of course, it's referring to the Mehra et al. Study. So, on the heels of this, you have the MHRA suspending the hydroxychloroquine arm of the principal trial, which was led by Oxford University. You've got the World Health Organization suspending trials, all trials on hydroxychloroquine, and you have the FDA revoking their emergency use authorization of the drug. Again, all on the heels of this study. You've got, obviously, I've got a quote from Anthony Fauci here saying the scientific data is really quite evident now about the lack of efficacy for it. He's referring to hydroxychloroquine. And there's a likelihood of adverse events with regard to cardiovascular issues. So we see this play out. We also see any of these doctors that promoted hydroxychloroquine. I'm thinking of Vladimir Zelenko with the Zelenko protocol, and in France you have Dr. Didier Raoult. And these doctors were blacklisted. Didier Raoult, I think he faced 2 years of having his medical license suspended, his papers being retracted. So they faced severe backlash, these doctors and scientists who advocated hydroxychloroquine as a early COVID treatment. The same thing happened with ivermectin. I've got the infamous FDA tweet there. You're not a horse, you're not a cow. Seriously, you all stop it. And it was very evident here. You have a coordinated campaign coming from the FDA. So there is on the sort of bottom right panel, you see this is a screenshot of a leaked email coming from an FDA official writing to Janet Woodcock, who was at the time the director of the FDA. And this media official is essentially boasting how well this tweet did. Oh, it went viral. And I've just highlighted about 14.5 million impressions from this tweet. But we see again ivermectin and all the doctors and scientists who promoted that faced severe backlash, and also many papers and studies which found it to be effective. And I'm including meta-analyses, peer-reviewed studies were either outright rejected by leading journals or were retracted or withdrawn. So now I'm going to just move to the next slide. The book also goes into the history of mRNA technology. I thought this was really important because, yeah, we know that these mRNA-based shots, this was the way out of lockdowns, right? This is what they were saying. We have to wait for a vaccine. So you see what I thought was really interesting. It's this quote from a program manager at DARPA. This is taken from 2010, and he states, what if we could use mRNA to create a vaccine in days and weeks instead of 3 to 10 years? So this chapter really hones in on DARPA being this sort of leading this sort of mRNA technology, holding Moderna's hand, so to speak. So you see this play out. You see his quote, you see this need for an mRNA-based vaccine to deal with like if a novel pathogen pandemic arises. You have 2013, you've got this key grant of $25 million being given to Moderna. Moderna at this time, has not had any product approved. The book also talks about the DARPA's Adept and its P3 platform. These are the two programs, and it's essentially aiming for countermeasures to be produced within 60 days. I also thought it was interesting to highlight the toxicity issues relating to the mRNA platform and the lipid nanoparticle problems. You have that coming even late 2010s. You have Moderna failing to go past phase 1. You have animals dying, liver toxicity issues. There are unresolved safety issues to do with this platform. What's also interesting, you have pre-311, you've got Moderna struggling as a unicorn with no approved products. You have even insiders saying that, we need to pray for a Hail Mary to happen. It's got a lot of financial pressures. And then lo and behold, we've got March 11th, pandemic declared. We go into Operation Warp Speed. Then you've got billions of dollars flowing into Moderna and also BioNTech. You've got Spikevax, Moderna's COVID shot being produced 63 days from its sequence to first dosing. And what's interesting is that going back to my timeline in the beginning of the book, you have January 10th, as I mentioned before, that's when the genomic sequence of the virus gets uploaded. January 13th is also when Moderna, with the vaccine, NIH's vaccine researcher, deciding on its sequence for Spikevax, just 3 days later. Right. So this chapter, and I just took two screenshots of the exhibits in the book, but this actually speaks to a very damning leaked European Medicine Agency emails. And these emails and documents, they stemmed from around November 2020 period. And they're very damning because you have the insider, these European Medicine Agency officials highlighting the problem with BioNTech's vaccine. There's a huge difference between the mRNA integrity, the quality between the clinical trial batches, sort of made sort of small scale batches, with the commercial batches, which were essentially rolled out to the public. And you have a drop in mRNA integrity. Nobody knows, and there's lots of emails. The book goes into this in quite detail, where they don't know they don't know the safety and efficacy implications because of this. They flag it as a major objection, and it's essentially resolved by them just lowering the standard down to around 50% of the mRNA molecule being intact. And that's how they essentially resolve it. But again, this is just before, few weeks before EUA is granted. And you also see a real rush, like a political pressure, this race by all the agencies, regulators, to be the first to approve these COVID shots. Right. This actually leads now to the DNA contamination scandal. And I really wanted to write about this. This is incredibly important. The chapter's called Beyond the Label. And it also speaks, in a sense, to those emails that we just saw earlier. You have the clinical trials, and they were made by Process One, which led to essentially a slightly cleaner product because they used magnetic build filtration systems. It was a much more expensive way to produce the shots, compared to Process Two, where they used a E. coli bacterial plasmid template. But what happened is that you got a lot of residual plasmid DNA as resulting from that Process Two. You have Kevin McKernan, a leading genomics expert. In early 2023, he was the first leading scientist to highlight this. He tested the vials in an independent lab, and he came and it's really damning, these findings. It was sort of billions to hundreds of billions of fragments of these DNA, of this plasmid DNA, as well as endotoxins as well. Both Pfizer and Moderna vials were contaminated with DNA, but it was Pfizer's vials that also were contaminated with undisclosed SV40 promoter enhancer sequences. And this is extremely dangerous because it facilitates nuclear entry. I've got an important quote coming from Dr. Philip Buckholtz. So he spoke at the South Carolina Senate testimony. He is a USC cancer genomics professor, and he states, I sequenced all the DNA. This DNA can and likely will integrate into the genomic DNA of cells, a real hazard for genome modification, and a very real theoretical risk of future cancer. I also went on to interview Maria Gucci, Canadian pharmacist, and she's very experienced with regulatory approvals, and she spoke about the lipid nanoparticles essentially being a Trojan horse for delivery, going into the cell, into the nucleus of the cell, potential for genomic integration. Obviously, you've got the risk of insertional mutagenesis and oncogenicity, essentially cancer, risk of cancer. These findings were not just found by McKernan, but also you've got another study, Spiker et al., David Spiker, who I've also interviewed, and they also found the same thing in their independent labs. What's also interesting, you have regulatory confirmations of this by Health Canada and the European Medicine Agency. What is interesting is that I also sent a Freedom of Information request to the UK's MHRA, asking them, do they have any plans of testing for the DNA contamination? And they said flatly, no, we have no intentions of testing the COVID shots looking, for plasmid DNA. So that was really shocking. I'm going to now move on to the next slide. Now, the blind watchdogs I coined, which is obviously I'm talking about the regulators here, the MHRA, the FDA, the EMA. And this I thought was important to highlight to people what the regulators knew before and also shortly after EUA of the COVID shots were granted. So this chapter, you've got a key FDA slide. This is a meeting that happened in October 2020. It's a VRBPAC meeting, and the slide is really damning. It's essentially 7 to 8 hour meeting, but the slide comes on for literally maybe like a second because it wasn't meant to be shown. It came up and it flashes for a second, it disappears, but there's a screenshot in the book. And you have a list of expected serious adverse events to do with the COVID shots. You've got myocarditis, pericarditis, stroke, GBS, thrombocytopenia, and death. So this is what they knew. This was on their radar before EUA was granted. Despite these known risks, obviously EUA we know was granted in December 2020. These shots were promoted as safe and effective. I went on to analyze, actually, I was one of the first journalists to look at the Pfizer's cumulative analysis of adverse event reports, and it was over the first 3 months when the EUA, since the EUA was granted. And this came about because of a Freedom of Information Act request where the FDA had to disclose the documents that they relied on to authorize the Pfizer and BioNTech COVID shot, because they actually wanted the public to wait till 2096, but they got taken to court and they had to release. So I dug through many of these documents. So that's highlighted in the book. Over 1,000 deaths in the first 90 days. Following the COVID shots, you've got over 40,000 cases of adverse events. I also I looked at, and I actually found this, looking through thousands of documents, I came upon the Pfizer, this is very damning. This is Pfizer's pregnancy and lactation cumulative review. And this was signed off in April 20th, 21. This is the date of the review. You've got about 458 pregnancy cases, over half, 248, reported with adverse events, including 51 spontaneous abortions. You've got fetal tachycardia. So this is the fetus is being affected, premature deaths being reported. But what is so egregious is that just 3 days later, April 23rd, this is after the FDA signed off on this review, the CDC begins recommending the COVID shot for pregnant women. And obviously, we see that also happening around the world. You had the same thing happen in the UK. And I also looked at pediatric deaths. So pediatric case is anyone aged under 17. These are children who died following the COVID shots, many dying from myocarditis. What was really shocking, and these PSURs, this I wrote for Children's Health Defence Europe. These were safety reports submitted by Pfizer and BioNTech to the European Medicine Agency, and they had to do that every 6 months or so. And it was really shocking what I found in that. And again, autopsies were often missing, not done, and causality was always dismissed. It was always the investigator saying this has got nothing to do with this death has nothing to do with the COVID shot. This chapter also looks at the EMA's Vigilance database, and this I really wanted to highlight the amazing work done by the forensic data analyst from the Netherlands, Wouter Okema. So I've interviewed Wouter about 3 times, and so these interviews are also in the book. And he, with this amazing software tool that he's developed, was able to download millions, like 15 million files from Vigilance. And Vigilance, it was a very difficult database because it's so hard to navigate. You can't, to see it, but he was able to download these files. And what he found was that there were 3 times more case safety reports for the COVID shots than all other drugs combined over a 20-year period. And what was also quite interesting is that he found the most reported side effect of the shots was COVID-19 itself. So there you have it. I thought it was also important to highlight the quote from Dr. Eric Rubin, who is the New England Journal of Medicine's editor, and he also sits on the FDA. He's a member. And he notoriously said, October 2021, this is when they are debating or voting whether to authorize the Pfizer shot for 5 to 11-year-olds. He states, we're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is until we start giving it. So I thought it was important to highlight that. Right, moving on to the next slide. Right, we have censoring harms. So I thought this was vitally important. This shows how the scientists were essentially, dissenting scientists were silenced, how the vaccine injured was silenced, and also how science was censored. So I've interviewed Dr. Robert Malone several times. He talks a lot about this, how he was deplatformed, how he was erased from LinkedIn. I also have interviewed Dr. Peter McCullough. Many of his papers were retracted. You've got the dismissal from Harvard University of Dr. Martin Kulldorff because he was advocating for natural immunity. He refused to get a COVID shot. He was dismissed from his position. But also the chapter, and obviously the book, focuses a lot on the vaccine injured and how their voices were suppressed. I've interviewed Stephanie de Grey, who is the mother of Maddie de Grey. Maddie de Grey was a participant of Pfizer's adolescent clinical trial, and how her TikTok accounts, her Facebook accounts were shut down. This chapter highlights this a lot. It also refers to the Trusted News Initiative. And this is really interesting. The Trusted News Initiative, its powers were expanded just about 30, I believe, March 27th, 2020. So this is just kind of a few weeks after the pandemic is declared. You've got Trusted News Initiative, which is a network of legacy media, big tech, and government, how it expanded its powers to combat COVID disinformation. And it was all about countering that. And it's a network that cuts across all these different platforms. You saw the BBC helming that, leading this, and there is also chapter, a section of the chapter which talks about how the BBC were flagging Facebook accounts of the vaccine injured and how they were using carrot emojis to circumvent censors. And you've got the BBC bragging about that, doing an article on that and highlighting it and how happy they were that these accounts got taken down by Facebook. So again, very damning. But also, I wanted to highlight how science itself, these scientific articles were being censored. So in the Netherlands, you had a very damning study by Mossert et al., which talked about excess deaths, and even the Telegraph wrote on this study. And the study did sort of, it spoke about the COVID shots, and it didn't make a black and white finding like it's to do, but it mentions the COVID shots as being a possibility. And instant you have the institution of these scientists who wrote that report distancing itself from this study. And this study was published in the British Medical Journal. You have all of a sudden a expression of concern being slapped onto the study. And it's a result of obviously this inconvenient study coming out. And it speaks to censorship. You also have a lot of these sort of DNA contamination papers being attacked through PubPeer, and which is also dubbed PubSpear by many of these scientists, and how a lot of the reviewers had a lot of conflicts of interest. Also, I wanted to highlight letters being sent to Wouter Ockemmer and other European researchers. This is from the EMA demanding that they delete their data. Again, they're obviously in such panic and they want that data deleted. You've also got Wouter, an interview with him. He talks about how 40% of serious vigilance reports, this is just to do with the COVID shots, had been retroactively altered or deleted. And essentially, he actually later told me it wasn't deleted per se. It was a floating duck syndrome where you had the numbers, the ID numbers associated with the reports. Every time a change was made, an edit to the case summary, even including a comma or a period, the number would change, so you could never trace it. So essentially, it disappeared. And that's what happened. I also write about the UKHSA's refusal to release anonymized vaccination death data linking to excess deaths. Sorry, that slide is not finished. Sorry about that. But it's essentially, it's really, I found this really damning. The UKHSA actually got taken to court by some scientists wanting them to release this data, and they refused because they actually said it would cause too much distress, emotional harm to the families of the bereaved families of people who've died from the COVID shots if they release this data. So it's just it's egregious what they've done. Again, we've got this rampant censorship taking place. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So this is coming close to the end of the presentation. So the final chapter, I look at it talks about it's for your safety is what it's called, because we see that a lot of these measures happening, it's always for your safety, for your own good. This is the guise, the banner that they use. But what we're seeing crisis leading to control, deeper and deeper control. And I look also at the history of this. So it goes back to 2001. We have the Amerithrax, the letters that were with these anthrax letter scares that were sent. And we've got this rise of this biodefense industrial complex taking place. You've got the introduction of Project BioShield, where you're seeing billions of dollars being funneled and going to countermeasures. And I talk about a leading figure, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cadlick, and his ties with Emergent Biosolutions, which was the sole supplier of the anthrax vaccine. And it caused so much harm to many US soldiers, this anthrax vaccine. It actually caused Gulf War syndrome. I talk about the liability shields there and how it essentially helped shape the legal framework later used for Operation Warp Speed. I also talk about these pandemic exercises that happened to occur a year prior. In 2019, it starts with Crimson Contagion from January to August 2019. You have a group of US tourists who go to China, they contract this novel respiratory virus, they come back to the United States and they spread the virus. This is actually quite important because it's led by Robert Cadlick. Again, a key figure in all of this. You also have the fall of that year. Around October 2019, you have Event 201 take place. This again is a major pandemic exercise, simulation exercise. And what you have coming out of Event 201 is the calls for media and big tech to work together with the government. So you've got private and public sector to suppress misinformation. I'm going to jump down to the quote at the bottom of this slide. This is directly coming out of Event 201. It's one of its recommendations. Governments and the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat mis and disinformation. False messages are suppressed, including through the use of technology. So you have this sort of blueprint, coming out of Event 201, and you see that become operational post 3/11. You have this machinery of countering disinformation. Again, you've got the TNI, Trusted News Initiative. We've got the Center of Countering Digital Hate, which has become quite, very notorious, CCDH. They came out with this Disinformation Dozen report. I happened to interview Sayer G. He's actually one of the people listed on this Disinformation Dozen report, as well as RFK Jr. and many other scientists and doctors. And they were caused to be the leading anti-vaxxers and for causing many deaths. Even you have President Biden talking at the time how these Disinformation Dozen are killing people, that they are deadly. You've got also in the UK, we had the Centre Countering Disinformation Unit, CDU. And then you have the 77th Brigade, which is really, this is a British Army unit, and its sole purpose is to do psyops and to spy on the British public. So I write about this. I write about this Big Brother Watch, big report that came out because it again based on Freedom of Information Act released documents of what was going on at the time. You have the CDU. There's actually 5 secretive Whitehall units spying on the British public and flagging their social media posts. If they were talking about anything against the vaccine, anything against lockdowns, even leading scientists were flagged. You've also got the governments, particularly the US government, exerting direct pressure on social media platforms. We've got the Twitter files and the famous Missouri versus Biden case, exposing how the White House coerced these platforms to essentially censor and deplatform people. You have a coordinated censorship taking place. I also write about which I found very eerie, was this psychological inoculation, these online viral video games backed by NATO and funded by the UK government, and essentially pathologizing dissent. And the book talks about that as well. But what we have coming out of this, you have binding laws, sort of a permanent infrastructure of censorship. You've got the UK Online Safety Act as a result of this, and also the CCDH was crucial as an ideological engine for censorship, for mass censorship, because it boasted how it was key in drafting that legislation, helping the government, advising the government for the Online Safety Act. In the EU, the equivalent there is the Digital Services Act. But all of this, and I wanted to also highlight how vaccine passports was sort of seen as like a gateway. They were the proof of concept, and it showed how people complied and they were giving up their freedoms, or their freedoms were conditional. They had to be earned, to go to the supermarket, to go to a restaurant, to fly. And now what are we seeing? We're seeing this rise of this push for digital IDs. And I really fear for this, because what we are seeing essentially is a rise of digital authoritarianism being seen across the West. And that's the end of my presentation. I think I've got one maybe last slide, sorry. um, I wanted to end with, so the book, the first epigraph, I think chapter 1, is taken from a section of a book written by Dr. Robert Cadlick. It was written in 1998, but I found it so it was really, really important, and I'm just going to read it. Using biological weapons under the cover of an endemic or natural disease occurrence provides an attacker the potential for plausible denial. Biological warfare's potential to create significant economic loss and subsequent political instability, coupled with plausible denial, exceeds the possibilities of any human weapon. So I found that to be really, really telling. And the book essentially, I really go into the machinery of this, how we've got crisis leads to fear, leads to more expanded powers, the rise of the bio-industrial complex, the censorship apparatus, and for your safety being used, justified for permanent control. But the book does end on a hopeful note. I like to stay positive. So the antidote to all of this is knowledge, is the truth seeking, open scientific debate, informed consent, courage to question official narratives, and forensic evidence over plausible denial. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your time. That's the end of my presentation.